Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's lunchtime expedition, and a big thank you to Corey for jumping in as I was dealing with some technology issues on my end. My name is Nathan Dorr, and I'm the curator of the Draper Natural History Museum, and it's my pleasure and honor to introduce today's speaker. Before I introduce her, however, I want to acknowledge and thank Sage Creek Ranch and the Nancy-Carroll Draper Charitable Foundation for their ongoing support of the Draper Speaker Series. You can find our previous lectures on our YouTube channel, and if you want to be added to our email list, feel free to let Corey or I know, feel free to let us know in the chat, or to drop us an email or give us a call. Today, we are so excited to welcome Dr. Diana Tomback. Dr. Tomback is professor of integrative biology at the University of Colorado, Denver, with expertise in forest ecology and conservation biology. She received her bachelor's and master's degree at UCLA and her PhD at the University of California, Santa Barbara. As a graduate student, Dr. Tomback began pioneering studies of the Clark's Nutcracker, a Keystone avian seed disperser, and an ecologically important but rapidly declining high elevation conifer whitebark pine. Author of more than 100 peer-reviewed publications and lead editor of the 2001 book Whitebark Pine Communities, Ecology and Restoration, Tomback has conducted research in national parks, national forests across the western US and Canada, all supported by funding from the US Forest Service, the National Park Service, National Science Foundation, and the Ricketts Conservation Foundation. In 2001, she and colleagues started the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation, based in Missoula, Montana, to advocate for the restoration. Tomback served as volunteer director of that foundation for 16 years and now oversees policy and outreach. And it's in this role she's a key organizer of the National Whitebark Pine Restoration Plan in partnership with the U.S. Forest Service and American Forests. I especially want to thank Dr. Tomback for taking time out of her field season to join us today. So, without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Diana Tomback. Thank you so much.
Hello, everybody. I'm really glad to be here, and I'd like to thank Nathan and Corey for the invitation to come and talk to you about what's obviously my favorite subject. And we'll get going here. Great. All right, well, I'm going to introduce the characters in the Whitebark Pine story. In the center, we have Whitebark Pine, which is a high elevation tree that's known to all of you who enjoy hiking, camping, backpacking. And another character in the story is the Clark's Nutcracker, which is the primary seed disperser for Whitebark Pine. They clearly have a partnership. And then the villain in the story is white pine blister rust caused by an invasive fungal pathogen. More about this, but let's get started here. And I'm going to ask for a little bit of support here.
Click here. Just anywhere on here. No, I figure out.
Okay, there we go. Thanks, Corey. So I grew up in West Hollywood, California. And like most people who grow up in Hollywood, you are obsessed with movies. And I will point out that my inspiration for the title of this comes from a lot of movies that are stories. And these stories all have different endings. Some are happy endings and some are tragic endings. And certainly hoping that the Whitebark Pine story has a happy ending. So let's see how we can get there. Quick outline of the presentation, distribution of whitebark pine, the ecology, a little bit about current research I do, threats and extent of decline, species status, whitebark pine conservation status, restoration strategy, and then the National Whitebark Pine Restoration Plan. So here are some pictures of whitebark across its range. You can see that its growth form varies with its age and the environment that it's in. One of my favorite pictures is this one of a very old whitebark in the Wind River Mountains. Took this at Union Pass. Some of you should be familiar with these locations. And then I'll point out that whitebark in the Sierra Nevada looks an awful lot like Great Basin bristlecone pine, if you've seen that. They're all growing on these volcanic soils, which might have something to do with that. A little bit of history here about Clark's nutcracker and whitebark pine. Actually, both species were first seen by the Lewis and Clark expedition. So September 6, 1805 was a time of hardship for the expedition. They were struggling to cross the Bitterroot Mountains into Idaho during an early season snowstorm. And as they crossed the pass, Clark likely observed whitebark pine, which wasn't known at that point, within a high elevation mixed coniferous forest. About a month before that, or actually just a couple of weeks, Clark first observed the Clark's nutcracker, of course, his namesake. He wrote a brief description. "I saw today bird of the woodpecker kind." No, you got that wrong. Oh well. "Which fed on pine burrs, its bill and tail white, the wings black, every other part of a light brown, and about the size of a robin." Less than a year later, on the return trip, Lewis shot a nutcracker. He described it in some detail, and he did get it right. The specimen was later identified as related to crows and jays, ravens, the corvid family, and formally named for Clark by Alexander Wilson. So the range of whitebark pine. This range is highly extensive, from about 37 degrees latitude at the southern tip of the Sierra, all the way up to 55 degrees north in British Columbia, 54 degrees north in Alberta. Whitebark pine within this distribution is restricted to the upper subalpine and treeline zones, and 88% of the distribution in the United States is on federally managed land. So estimated US aerial coverage by the US Fish and Wildlife Service is more than 56 million acres. And the US range is about 70% of the total range of whitebark. So whitebark was finally described officially by George Engelmann. This is the botanist who Engelmann spruce was named for in 1863. And I will mention that there's something a little different about whitebark pine. Unlike most of our other North American pines, it is believed that the ancestor to whitebark migrated across a Bering Strait land bridge, and that it was probably closely related to Siberian stone pine, which also was dispersed by a nutcracker, the Eurasian nutcracker. It is not known exactly when this event occurred, but the ancestor to whitebark and likely the nutcracker both came over together. So the whitebark pine distribution by land ownership, and this is US Fish and Wildlife Service data. So 74% of whitebark's distribution in the US is on national forest land, and that's in the bright green on the map. 10% is on National Park Service land, and that is the purple all over the map, purple patches. 4% on BLM land, and we have some here in Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, and 12% on other land ownerships, tribal lands such as the Wind River Reservation, the Blackfeet Reservation. We can see this in yellow and sort of a peach color. So whitebark pine community types come in 3 different forms. Successional communities generally occur lower in the subalpine on favorable sites. So whitebark grows in mixed forest associations with spruce and fir. And we can see this picture from Tiwanaut in Grand Teton National Park. Climax communities on exposed upper subalpine sites. These tend to be a little drier, a little colder. So this is right up here on the Beartooth Plateau. And then treeline communities on cold, arid sites at the higher elevations. These community types definitely vary with site conditions. So the successional communities, whitebark tends to be an early successional species, a pioneer, as we say. It gets in first, thanks to the Clark's nutcracker. And then it experiences competitive replacement by shade-tolerant species, primarily spruce fir, but also hemlock. Some whitebark, as we see, can persist into the late cereal community, and then fire comes along, or maybe localized pine beetle mortality, and the successional sequence starts over again. Now, at higher elevations and on arid, windswept sites with poor soil, we have climax or self-replacing communities. In them, there's continuous but sparse regeneration over time. Whitebark can dominate or co-dominate with other species. And then finally, treeline community. At the upper subalpine forest edge, we call this the alpine treeline ecotone, which transitions into tundra. Up there, conifers assume dwarf and flag growth forms, and whitebark pine is a dominant component of treeline communities on dry, windswept slopes. And we actually looked at this specifically in the Greater Yellowstone Area as well. But these dry, whitebark-dominated communities are prevalent along the eastern slopes. These are sort of rain shadow areas, all the way up the Rocky Mountains, but also in the Cascades and the Sierra Nevada. Now, in the Rocky Mountains, trees that grow by themselves in these treeline communities generally are whitebark pine. Whitebark is tough and drought resistant. So a little bit about Clark's nutcracker and whitebark pine together. This is regarded as a co-evolved mutualism. In other words, over time, both species have evolved adaptations to interact with one another. So adaptations of whitebark pine. Well, the seeds are large and wingless and highly attractive to nutcrackers. Most conifers have seeds that bear a thin, woody seed wing. When cones open, the seeds are dislodged from the cones, and they will travel a long distance from the parent tree thanks to the wind, which causes the seed to gyrate as it falls, prolonging its distance. But even then, most conifer seeds fall within a few hundred feet of the parent tree. In the case of whitebark, the seeds don't have a chance to fall. The cones remain closed even after the seeds ripen. You can see the picture here of a mature cone. The other thing about whitebark is the whole growth form seems well adapted for nutcrackers. The branches are all upswept or vertically oriented, and the cones project horizontally, giving the birds good landing platforms. But even more, the seeds are adapted for being buried in the ground by nutcrackers, and they can remain viable for years under the soil. And in this photo here, we can see that nutcrackers have started to remove seeds from cones. Let's talk a bit about nutcrackers. Birds have a throat pouch. Technically, it's called a sublingual pouch. And the pouch is expandable. And a single nutcracker can carry more than 100 seeds. A large nutcracker can carry perhaps 125, 150 whitebark pine seeds. And the birds place these seeds in subterranean caches of 1 to 15 seeds, more typically 3 to 5. And the seeds are buried maybe an inch deep in substrate, whether it's soil or gravel. And with the ability to transport seeds in this pouch, nutcrackers will bury these caches anywhere from just a few feet from a parent tree to up to 20 miles, that's 32 kilometers from the parent tree. They fly long distances. Sometimes they take the seeds to higher elevations, sometimes to lower. So I've estimated that a single bird will cache more than 35,000 whitebark pine seeds per year if the cone crop is good. Others have calculated slightly higher values. So these caches in the ground, nutcrackers use them when food is scarce during the winter and spring. And by the way, they reproduce in early spring, and they feed their young seeds from these caches, and they recover the caches using highly accurate spatial memory. Those caches they don't get to by the time the snow melts, or if unfortunately we lose a nutcracker, there's a lot of seeds in the ground, and spring rains, snow melt will trigger germination, leading to forest regeneration. So where do nutcrackers cache their seeds? Well, the answer is pretty much everywhere, but specifically they like steep slopes, especially southerly or westerly faces, because the snow melts off rapidly or the wind will blow the slopes free of snow. They will also cache in open forests, closed forests, on the forest floor, on bare rocky terrain, recent burns, more about that in a second, clear cuts, and up to tree line and tundra. So in 1988, as you know, we had major fires in the Greater Yellowstone. And in 1989, there was a huge whitebark pine cone crop, and I was on Mount Washburn watching nutcrackers busily harvest the seeds and storing them in the still highly ashy, sooty substrate. So there is a nutcracker taken with a pre-digital camera. And then we established a series of plots on Mount Washburn and in order to monitor post-fire regeneration. And by 1991, there were clusters of seedlings. And guess what? 1 to 15, mostly 3 to 5, coming out of the ground in all of our plots. So nutcrackers were doing their job. Here you can see a picture of the sublingual pouch, and I'll also mention if you see pink nutcrackers, it's because they've been harvesting whitebark pine seeds. The cones, the unripe cones have anthocyanin pigments. These are purple, and the birds just get covered in these things. So nutcrackers determine where whitebark pine grows on the landscape, along with environmental conditions. So by caching seeds above tree limits, tree line can respond to changing climate. Whitebark will grow as conditions become more favorable, and actually we're seeing that now in one of our study sites. Nutcrackers will disperse seeds farther than wind dispersed seeds will travel. And here is a graph showing that the closer to a seed source, the denser the whitebark. And this is in a large fire or a burn after the fire. And this curve goes out to more than 3 kilometers. And obviously the closer to the seed source, the higher the density. We've already mentioned that nutcrackers transport seeds very long distances, much farther than wind dispersed seeds will travel. And nutcrackers can transport seeds against prevailing winds, giving whitebark pine an advantage. Seed dispersal by Clark's nutcracker also results in a fascinating population genetic structure for whitebark pine. So you'll often see whitebark pine growing in clusters, many trunks together. And genetic analysis that we've done and others has shown that each trunk is an individual tree, a different genotype. And these are individuals that germinated in a nutcracker cache, tolerated the crowding, and grew to maturity. So this is a very unique fine-scale population structure. And because nutcrackers fly such long distances, populations are not differentiated. The birds are mixing up the genes. Well, whitebark pine itself has some very important traits. Whitebark is important to our forests. First of all, whitebark is a keystone species. It occurs in a huge spectrum of community types, and there are 7 distinct community types recognized by the Society of American Foresters. High elevation whitebark pine communities provide wildlife habitat and nest sites, and the seeds are very popular as a wildlife food. Each seed is large and nutritious. So I won't go through this in detail, but there are species from 8 different families of birds that will readily use whitebark pine seeds once nutcrackers start opening up those cones and making them available. Most of these are songbirds, but we also have woodpeckers and grouse that will use the seeds. The seeds are also eaten by carnivores. Grizzly bears and black bears will raid pine squirrel middens. Now, a midden is a pile of cones that are stored by pine squirrels to get through the winter, but not if these bears come along, and they will raid the middens and feast literally on the whitebark pine seeds. And then if in fall or spring you come across bear scat, you can often see the shells of the seeds integrated into the scat. Recently, we learned that red foxes will do the same thing and eat whitebark pine seeds. Whitebark pine communities also comprise important wildlife habitat. And these are all the species that we've all seen using whitebark pine habitat. Wolverine has been caught on camera traps, and as well as coyotes and wolves, mountain lions, lynx. Some of these animals we've seen in person, like moose and elk. So whitebark is very important for as habitat and for nesting, also for birds of prey. Whitebark is also a foundation species, and this term is just starting to enter our lexicon again. It was originally used by Dayton a long time ago, and Aaron Ellison rediscovered this and realized how relevant the term is. A foundation species defines ecostructure and function in a community. In the case of whitebark, it comes in very early after disturbance, thanks to Clark's nutcracker, and it's very tolerant of harsh conditions and aridity. And by coming in, it creates shade and moisture that enables other conifers and even understory plants to become established. Because whitebark can tolerate these harsh conditions, it is a nurse tree on harsh sites, and spruce and fir will often grow next to it, protected by from the wind, protected by whitebark. Sometimes they will overtop a whitebark and outcompete it. No good deed goes unpunished, unfortunately. Other ecosystem services that whitebark provides. The high elevation forests and tree-lined communities actually redistribute and retain snow. This is a picture from Grand Teton National Park. Shade from these forests will actually slow summer snowmelt, which makes sure that there is continuous downstream flow. The roots of whitebark stabilize soil, reducing soil erosion, and the very presence of the trees can reduce avalanche hazard on these steep slopes. Here we have some pictures from our research showing how these tree-lined communities create patches, redistributing the snow. And whitebark has traditional and cultural significance. In ecosystem services lingo, this is provisioning services. Native Americans, First Nations of Canada have used whitebark pine as a food resource. The seeds can be cooked, roasted. They can be eaten immediately or stored. Sometimes dried seeds are mixed with service berries and stored. They can be ground to make mush and then cakes. And I will point out that pines in general have been used historically as a starvation food for many indigenous peoples. They will strip the bark off trees and they will eat the inner bark, which has a number of sugars and nutrients, roasted or raw. This is probably underreported for most pines throughout the United States. A little bit about our research. We have looked at whitebark tree line across the Rocky Mountains from the very edge of whitebark in the north down through its southernmost range in the Rocky Mountains and the Wind Rivers. And we appreciate support, by the way, from Shoshone National Forest and from Kent Houston for this work at Christina Lake. But this graph, the blue, represents whitebark and shows the proportion of all the solitary trees of tree line in these tree line communities, and whitebark certainly dominates. And then looking at the proportion of tree islands, these are patches of mixed conifers that whitebark occupies, again, you can see in almost all these communities across the range, whitebark is dominating. We also are studying subalpine forest recovery after the 1988 Yellowstone fires, and we're starting to get some papers out. We just did the 28-year remeasurement, and it's actually 30 years after the Yellowstone fires. It's really remarkable how time has gone, but our study areas are on Henderson Mountain outside of Cook City and on Mount Washburn. A quick peek at Henderson Mountain. I am sad to say conifer regeneration is fairly sparse. It's there, it's coming back, but slowly. And one thing we've learned that I'll share with you is that whitebark pine seedlings grow a lot faster on burned seed beds, as shown in the red color. Oops, back that up. This is on a dry site, the other's on a moist site, and the growth rates in the burned seed beds were higher on the moist sites than the seedling growth rates in unburned forests. So we had unburned controls. So whitebark thrives in burned terrain. In contrast, this is what Mount Washburn looks like nearly 30 years after the Yellowstone fire. What a difference. And stay tuned for our papers to find out what's going on. One paper just published, just literally a week ago, came from my doctoral student, Elizabeth Pansing. And this is a model of increasing fire return intervals, which is predicted for the Greater Yellowstone, and what the extirpation risk is for whitebark. So I'll point out that with the historical fire return intervals staying the same, there would be little extirpation risk. But under climate change, fire frequency is increasing. We're getting reburns in areas burned just a few years ago in the Greater Yellowstone. And extirpation risk over time, you see, increases greatly in whitebark pine. What's interesting is the dotted line versus the solid line. The solid line incorporates long distance seed dispersal by nutcrackers, and that buys whitebark pine a little resilience. Now, the current study we're doing, the new study, is Clark's Nutcracker in Yellowstone National Park, and Thomas McLaren, a new grad student, is on this study. We're working with park managers, Doug Smith and Lauren Walker. Our objectives are to determine which forest communities are used by nutcrackers. Maybe there are seeds they're using that we weren't aware of, in addition to whitebark. So limber pine is definitely a seed that nutcrackers will use. It's also large and wingless. And we're also interested in constructing a monitoring protocol for nutcracker surveys to determine over time whether the nutcracker population is changing. Actually, we're most worried about the decline because Clark's Nutcracker is declining, and it's declining in the Greater Yellowstone. So here we have a picture of what I call the four horsemen of whitebark pine. And here are the four threats. The existential threat to whitebark pine is a fungal pathogen, Crenartium rubicola. Originally, it is believed from Siberia, and it causes the disease white pine blister rust. Mountain pine beetle kills mature trees, and we've gone through a huge outbreak of that. Altered fire regimes from past fire exclusion, but also increases in fire frequency. and climate warming, which of course drove mountain pine beetle outbreak and the increase in fire frequency. A little bit about blister rust. It was inadvertently introduced to the East Coast and the West Coast of the United States more than 100 years ago. And it has spread, as you can see, spread from its point of entry. On the West Coast, it was introduced, it is believed, in the Pacific Northwest, and over a century it has spread. So white pine blister rust in the branches of a tree will kill branches and reduce biomass for photosynthesis. It will reduce cone-bearing capacity. If the disease gets into the stem or the trunk of the tree, it will girdle the trunk after a number of years and kill the tree. These so-called infections, or cankers as we call them, and by the way, these are little fruiting bodies for the spores. These are fresh fruiting bodies in orange. If a tree canker in the branch, grows down into the trunk, it can also kill the tree. So blister rust is most prevalent in the Northern Rockies. These are incredible infection rates, with 90% in Southern Canada, and in the Flathead and Glacier National Park. Bob Marshall is not far behind this. In the Pacific Northwest, we have fairly high infection rates as well. Canada, of course, has a high infection rates. Greater Yellowstone, the mean is about 25%. Blister rust is ratcheting up now in California. It's now in the Southern Sierra, where it wasn't a few years ago, in Whitebark. Mountain pine beetle, we're just coming out of a 20-year outbreak. And looking at the mountain pine beetle footprint on whitebark pine, Wyoming is the champion with more than 1 million acres of whitebark pine impacted. If we combine blister rust and mountain pine beetle mortality, we can see, using at the watershed scale rather than the local scale, blowing this up, we can see clearly where the hazard has been. Whitebark is definitely in trouble. One thing we have discovered in our research, McKinney et al. And Behringer et al., is that nutcrackers assess seed availability. And as cone production diminishes from tree mortality or loss of tree canopy, nutcrackers do not go to places where they don't have a good food source. Small cone crops are problematic. With small cone crops, you can lose the entire cone crop to pine squirrels or pre-dispersal seed predation by nutcrackers. We have found in our work that if we have below 1,000 cones per hectare, and that would be on this graph here, the probability of nutcrackers coming in drops precipitously. Climate change in the Greater Yellowstone, a map from Andy Hansen and Tony Chang. The red is the deteriorating range of whitebark. In other words, projected by 2040 to 2070 to disappear. Green is the core area where it will remain, and yellow is future whitebark pine habitat. And the extent of the decline, well, a paper by Goking and Islar, they're Forest Service people, using forest inventory analysis data, indicated that as of 2016, 51% of all standing whitebark pine trees in the US were dead. And whitebark pine mortality outpaced its growth. And you can see that the Rocky Mountains are truly the epicenter of all of this, with less than 10% basal area in red, and live basal area remaining at 30 to 50% in many of these other areas. So the conservation status of whitebark pine through the International Union for Conservation of Nature is considered endangered. It was listed in Canada as endangered under the Species at Risk Act, and it is a candidate species under the U.S. Endangered Species Act. It is being evaluated right now, and we expect a decision later this fall. But there's hope. There is a way of restoring whitebark pine. So the most important method is to speed up natural selection by developing and planting seedlings that have genetic blister rust resistance. But also we can protect trees that are high value or resistant against mountain pine beetle using verbenone. And verbenone replicates the pheromone used by mountain pine beetles to keep beetles from colonizing a tree. We can renew successional stands using prescribed fire, silvicultural thinning. We can mitigate climate change by restoring whitebark where whitebark is going to remain or it will be. So that brings us to the National Whitebark Pine Restoration Plan. This is a multi-agency collaborative effort to rescue whitebark pine. It involves the Forest Service, Park Service, BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service, and some tribal lands. So I represent the Whitebark Pine Ecosystem Foundation. I am the lead from the foundation. Eric Sprague and Brian Kittler are my colleagues from American Forests, a global nonprofit. David Guazi and Bruce Molson are out of the Washington office in the U.S. Forest Service. So the components to the plan, it's a geographic restoration plan that's based on core areas. These core areas will represent 20 to 30% of whitebark's distribution. And the selection of these core areas will dovetail with the requirements by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Species Status Assessment Framework. So we will dovetail with their priorities, and we hope that this will inform a recovery plan for whitebark. In this very ambitious project, we are definitely breaking new ground. So here's a cartoon of our vision. So if seedlings are planted within the core areas that we nominate, and these seedlings have genetic resistance, they will grow to mature trees, and Clark's Nutcrackers will do the heavy lifting. They will harvest and transport these seeds out of the core areas, up to 30 kilometers, and establish blister rust resistant trees outside the core. We envision that this is going to take several human generations and probably several tree generations. So the components to the plan, nominated core areas, criteria used to select them, proposed restoration actions, implementation costs, monitoring and adaptive management sub-strategies to make sure that restoration has done what we want it to. So the planned products, we anticipate these probably at the end of 2021 or early in 2022. So I am compiling the best management practices, a summary of that's in progress. We will write a general technical report summarizing all the core area nominations across all the federal agencies and tribes who participate. And American Forests will produce a summary that's accessible with good maps for public outreach. So this report, the general technical report, will provide a roadmap for strategic restoration that makes use of scarce resources. And American Forests, through its partnerships, will fundraise in the private sector and the corporate sector. And they will take over in phase 2. And we think that phase 2 will take from 10 to 15 years. So the federal agencies will be supported. They're not expected to come up with all the funding for the restoration. American Forests will help do the heavy lifting. So we are working toward a happy ending to the Whitebark Pine Story. And we hope this story will join those other stories with happy endings. So thank you all very much for listening, and hang on just a second. So quick acknowledgements to people who have collaborated in research, and a lot of graduate students over time, those who have contributed to the studies I discussed. And folks at American Forests and in the Washington office of the Forest Service and in Region 1 of the Forest Service. And if I can, I'd like to show you guys a short video, but I think I have to get out of my slideshow to do that. So hold on one second. Sorry for the technical difficulties, folks. Not exactly a sweet song, but it's music to my ears. Thank you. So white pine blister rust for white bark is a pandemic with very little resistance. And it's a lot like COVID and humans, and it's just spreading a little more slowly.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Tomback. For our virtual audience, if you have questions, just a reminder to use the chat or Q&A feature here on Zoom, and we'll direct those questions to Dr. Tomback. So I'll start us off, Dr. Tomback. I was wondering, with your long-term passion for and research in this subject area, if there's anything that still amazes you about these species, or things that have surprised you in more recent field seasons.
I'll have to think long and hard about this. One thing working in treeline, I will say, is I am so impressed at the broad geographic range over which nutcrackers disperse seeds. It's clear from our work up there that they are getting those seeds up to tree line just incredibly well. And the industriousness of nutcrackers, you folks need to watch them in fall as they harvest and pouch and then fly off and cache seeds. If you have the opportunity while hiking, it's truly impressive that these birds have accomplished all of this, that the distribution of whitebark pine is attributed to a species of bird. It is amazing.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. We do have a question coming in from Emily. Are there any trade-offs associated with rust resistance so that rust resistant individuals have lower fitness in the absence of the whitebark pine rust?
That's an excellent question, and it's a logical question. We don't know exactly whether there are fitness trade-offs, and we might learn more about that if we could successfully sequence the genome of whitebark pine. And by the way, that's a new initiative that we are engaging with David Neal, who is just retired from the University of California, Davis. He has a little bit of money to start looking into sequencing whitebark pine with his colleagues who have done sugar pine. But frankly, we're trying to raise $600,000. We think that this would help restoration of whitebark pine immensely. Right now, in order to figure out if whitebark pine is even resistant, it's a 3-year process and costs $1,200 per tree. But that is a very good question. To avoid bottlenecking in terms of genetic diversity with resistance, the only thing we can do right now is use a number of trees with resistance from different parent trees. And so I'll point out, there is a seed orchard in the Custer Gallatin with resistant whitebark pines, and there are a number of different genotypes in there. And that is to try to overcome exactly what Emily suggested, that there might be trade-offs. Now we know from bacteria and other studies that those bacteria that have resistance cannot compete with wild type. And so I share your concern, Emily. And in order to know this, we need to do the sequencing, but the best we can do right now is just to plant from a diversity of resistant genotypes. that's our best hope. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Another question coming in from James. Are any national parks included in the plan for planting blister rust resistant seedlings? And is the planting program in both US and Canada?
So just to clarify, the participants in this program include the National Park Service, and a couple of the parks have been planting already, even before the plan got underway. Glacier National Park has been planting for probably 2 decades now. Crater Lake National Park has been planting. But we need to have conversations about restoration strategies for these other parks. And I know for a fact that several of these parks and their superintendents are absolutely on board. They do not want to lose their whitebark pine. So we are just obviously at the beginning of working through what the actual restoration projects will be in their nominated core areas. But yep, I'm with you all the way. We need to do this.
Excellent, thank you. Along the lines of such a long-term study or various long-term studies, what have been some of the most significant changes in your research methods over that time?
Well, number one, I should say when I started out working on whitebark and Clark's Nutcracker in the Sierra Nevada range, which is in California, blister rust was nowhere on my radar screen. Blister rust was happening in the Rockies and in the Northwest, but not impacting me. And I'd say the primary change has been the threats to whitebark pine that I have seen in my lifetime and the damage that they've done. So the massive mountain pine beetle outbreak that we've all experienced, and of course, the Yellowstone area and Wyoming have been an epicenter of that. Could not have imagined that, but we should have, because historically, it's happened before in whitebark in the 1970s and in the 30s and 40s. So this is a natural disturbance. It's just that warming temperatures most likely fueled the extent of this outbreak. So I will say I never imagined when I started this work how much of an Eden the Sierra Nevada was, and was until just recently. And I never imagined that the species that I studied would be considered for endangered species listing. That's a shocking change.
Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing those thoughts. A reminder, a last reminder to any of our virtual participants, if you have any last minute questions, add those there into the chat or the Q&A feature. And seeing none coming in, I would like to thank you so much, Dr. Tomback, for your time, your passion, your expertise, and your enthusiasm for this topic. And thank, of course, our audience and remind them that they are able to view this and other past lunchtime expeditions on our YouTube channel. Of course, a major thank you to Sage Creek Ranch and the Nancy-Carroll Draper Charitable Foundation for their support of these programs. And again, a big thank you to Dr. Tomback again for taking time out of your field season. Some of you who are familiar with the Draper may have recognized the background. Dr. Tomback is joining us from the Draper lab because she is headed up to Yellowstone to finish up the current season of field work. But so again, thank you, Dr. Tomback, for sharing your time, your passion, and your expertise. So with that, I thank again everybody for joining us. We will be in touch with an upcoming lecture for next month. And in the meantime, be well and be safe. Take care.